koch to Ben and Natanya Haber. Welcome. Ben and his husband moved to Baltimore, a similar story, toward the beginning of the pandemic and decided, hey, maybe it's a good time to start checking out synagogues, and delighted to have you with us today. Yasher koch. And I, for one, am glad for air conditioning today. So thanks all of you who supported that campaign. Well done. It's good today to be at Beth Am, and it's good today to not be a horse. I mean, I think it's always good to not be a horse. I'm just saying today in particular it's good not to be a horse. This is a quote from a piece in the foreword this week. It's been a year since one of the most harrowing civilian tragedies ever experienced in Israel. The stampede and subsequent crush on Mount Meron that killed 45 people celebrating Lag BaOmer. So writes Dov Mezel, an Israeli first responder, about his experience during the Har Meron disaster last year. I was standing near the medical clinic of United Hatzalah on Mount Meron after the crush developed, he says, as people attempted to exit one area of the mountain and head to another. Several people slipped and fell on a narrow metal stairwell and were quickly trampled by those following behind them. As the first screams rang out, people began running. To be sure, this calamity was only made more horrifying by the fact that it occurred in a moment of supposed respite. Lag BaOmer is an island of joy in a sea of mourning on the Jewish calendar that our tradition tells us we're to observe during Sfarat HaOmer. Thousands of students were killed according to tradition by a plague, and Lag BaOmer was the break from that plague. So it's meant to be a time of celebration. The mostly Hasidic celebrants on Har Meron were acutely aware of that tradition, of course. Their joy on the 33rd day of the Omer was a counterpoint to their diminished happiness the other 48 days of the counting. Mezel goes on to describe how the EMS providers immediately switched to quote-unquote mass casualty incident, or MCI protocol. The basic idea is that when encountering a mass casualty event, the initial triage is done at the scene while patients are transported to a treatment area. This allows for the fastest possible treatment of the largest number of injured. Mezel's piece in the foreword is about mental health and his growing appreciation for the PCRU, the Psychotrauma and Crisis Response Unit. These healers of healers provide crisis counseling for people like Mezel and the many other first responders who deal with horrific tragedies on a regular basis. For his part, Mezel shares that this past year's work was atypical for him, much worse than a usual year. Very soon after the Har Meron tragedy, there was war with Hamas in Gaza, and then riots. Then the bleacher collapse in a shul during Shavuot, which killed 2 and injured hundreds. Barely a month later, he writes, I was dispatched with the PCRU to assist in Florida after the Surfside condo building collapse, which killed 98 people. All of these were triggers, jolting him back to the early 2000s and the Second Intifada, when suicide bombings were rampant and he lost his uncle in a bus bombing. As many of you know, I too lost a friend during that period as well. 20 years ago this July on Har HaTzofim, Mount Scopus, during another mass casualty incident, the murder of 9 people in a cafeteria in Hebrew University. Mount Meron, Mount Scopus. And then there's our Parsha that deals with events from another mountain. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe b'Har Sinai lemor. God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alehem, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, Ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem, when you enter the land that I assign you, v'shavta haaretz Shabbat ladonai, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. With your permission today, I don't want to tackle the very important topic of mental health, at least not directly. Instead, I'd like us to consider a Torahitic counterpoint to trauma. Because when the world is overwhelming, when it seems like every day brings new tragedies, new reports of heartache, vitriol, and violence, there must be things on which we can rely to help us remain whole, and even, dare I say, happy. Har Meron, the Omer tragedy of last year, the catastrophe of cut corners and hubris that enabled a cacophonous lurching from ecstatic joy to inescapable anguish, stands in sharp relief with Har Sinai, the locus of Jewish salvation. We live in a world of mass suffering, don't we? Buffalo, New York. Last Shabbat afternoon, an 18-year-old man who had been excessively bored during the pandemic and having imbibed a hateful ideology on the web walks into a grocery store in a black neighborhood and begins to exterminate human beings. That ideology, I'm sure you've heard, is called the Great Replacement. What is it? The most virulent strain of this racist and anti-Semitic canard suggests that Jews are conspiring with others to, quote-unquote, replace true white Americans with immigrants and people of color. The Anti-Defamation League has the following explanation on their website. Once largely relegated to white supremacist rhetoric, the Great Replacement has made its way into mainstream consciousness in the past several years. From the chants of Jews will not replace us on the University of Virginia campus, to then U.S. Representative Steve King's tweeted protest, "We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies," to Fox News' Tucker Carlson's complaints that the Democratic Party is attempting to replace the current electorate with third world voters, the racist conspiracy theory has well and truly arrived. Just how well has it arrived, you might be asking? A new AP research poll found that 32% of Americans believe that a group of people is trying to replace native-born Americans with immigrants for electoral gains. This figure includes nearly half of Republicans queried, one half of one party, 1/3 of Americans believe at least some version of this Great Replacement theory. Let's let that sink in for a moment. What else? This week, Rav Tyler and I were honored to join a delegation of nearly 30 Beth Amers as we went to Washington, D.C. to join the NCJW's abortion justice rally. The speakers were powerful and the gathering was boisterous, if also solemn. One of our older members recalled how she fought and protested for abortion access 50 years ago. Roe v. Wade is almost certainly to be overturned. How bad will the ruling be? Which other civil rights will it put at risk? How soon before zealous Christians and their allies try to impose their religious beliefs on the question of personhood? If Wordle can't handle fetus as an answer, what hope does America have? But what else? This week, as I mentioned, the U.S. surpassed 1 million COVID-19 deaths, more than any country on the planet. There are millions upon millions of us who have been affected by the disease, the loss of loved ones. Within a world of loss of loved ones, the impact of nagging and injurious symptoms. We are a nation in crisis within a world of crisis, and these are just a few of the many crises I suspect that are on our minds. We are faced with so many choices and also questions about who is making those choices and what is our agency in all of this. It is massive. Buffalo, New York. Mass casualty or mass justice to be found in the aftermath. Abortion access, massive disenfranchisement or massive respect for women, their bodies, and their choices. Church mass become public policy, or renewed interest in massive investment in personal autonomy, in kavod habriot, respect for our shared humanity. 1 million COVID deaths, mass public health failure, amassing the spreading of disinformation, misinformation, or a massive return to science, to the rule of law, and the promise of a data-driven policy agenda. Many choices have been made. Many more lie before us. How do we choose? Not necessarily what is right, but what might work. Or rather, how do we choose what is right that also might work? Where is our North Star when this world is spinning off of its axis? Enter Parashat Behar. The Torah portion offers a picture of a better tomorrow, a world in which the enslaved are set free, when debts are forgiven, where the land is allowed to rest and regain its nourishment. Shabbat, 1 in 7 days, becomes sabbatical. 1 in 7 years becomes Jubilee. 1 in 7 times 7 years. It's a flowering of rest and restoration, and in some ways it is utterly incomprehensible. The traditional commentators ask, why does the Parsha begin the way that it does? Why start with the words Behar Sinai? Rashi in the 11th century asks explicitly, what has the matter of the sabbatical year to do with Mount Sinai? That Scripture felt compelled to expressly state where it was commanded. Were not all commandments given on Sinai? Rashi's answer is that since these agricultural laws are not repeated in Deuteronomy, like so many other mitzvot, we may infer that all its general rules and specific prescriptions must have been promulgated on Sinai. So the Sinai experience lends a certain quality, a certain sheen to these particular mitzvot. The Sfat Emes, the 19th century, he wouldn't have called himself the Sfat Emet. The 19th century Hasidic master Yehuda Leib, Alter of Ger, also notices the connection between the place name and particulars of our Parsha. With regard to the relationship of sabbatical and Jubilee years to Mount Sinai, when the children of Israel received the Torah, they were prepared to become like the angels above. Indeed, there's a really beautiful midrash that suggests that at the moment of revelation, the entire mountain arose and ascended to heaven. So the Gera Rebbe explains that after the sin of the golden calf, the children of Israel had trouble accessing that same level of elevation and connectedness. But even after they sinned, he says, there remains for Israel times when this former power is awakened. This is true of Shabbat, when we set aside all the other tasks and are prepared to serve the Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's why Shabbat food, he says, is considered holy. In the times when there were sabbatical and jubilees, the whole year was Shabbat time, and the people of Israel enjoyed some of their former enlightenment. This is the true freedom of the Jubilee, of which it says, V'shavtem ish el achuzato, you shall return each man unto his possession. The point isn't that the Shemitah and the Yovel are practical, implementable solutions to mass suffering. The point is that they are an ideal against which we can measure our progress toward or our retreat from a just society. Do you know what the word utopia means? It comes from the Greek. It means no place. Utopian ideals are exactly that. They are imaginable but unachievable. And let's not forget, very countercultural. What is a prevailing form of entertainment these days? Dystopian novels and movies and the like, video games. And the genre, of course, is hardly new. When I was a teenager, I drank in Aldous Huxley and George Orwell and Ray Bradbury. And dystopian narratives are useful, to be sure, beyond their entertainment value. Who among us didn't feel just a little bit of pleasure watching the White House explode the first time you saw Independence Day? I mean, the graphics, the effects were amazing. The real value of dystopian works, though, is that they are cautionary tales. They warn us of the worst possible outcomes so that we might make different choices. The Bible is not devoid of such narratives, chevra. Job comes to mind, much of the former prophets too, but not our Parashat. Parashat Behar is a beacon of possibility, an invitation into an aspirational worldview. It is the thing we strive toward, not the thing we run from. Esa enai el heharim, I lift my eyes to the mountains, says the psalmist. From where does my help come? From Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. The sabbatical, the Jubilee, even Shabbat in its purest form. These are utopian spells that inevitably must be broken. Mount Meron was a sickening reality. Mount Sinai, in some ways, a dream. Shemitah, Yovel, a new world order in which suffering ends and all are treated as equal. It's a pipe dream. It's a fantasy. But fantasies and dreams are the stuff of hope, and hope is the stuff of progress. Without the impossible, we cannot reach the possible. And as improbable as progress may seem at the moment, Parashat Behar comes around each year to remind us that there is a better world waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. And sensing it there, somewhere off in the distance, we have simply no choice but to try to reach it. Shabbat Shalom.